Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Kargoz, and I'm joined today by the legendary warrior Takanashi. What's up, man?
Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. So we're back, guys. We're back for the Classic World of Warcraft Warrior Masterclass Part 3. In today's episode, let's see what we're getting into. We're getting into class mechanics. So just to touch base on the agenda here. Part 1, we just did a intro, syllabus review, all that good stuff. Part 2, we talked about faction, we talked about race. And Part 3, we're getting into some of the meat and potatoes. Class mechanics. So, here's what we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about the melee role, understanding your advantages and your limitations. We're going to talk about stats, how stats interact with you as a warrior, what stats you should pursue and why. We're going to talk about your resources. As a warrior, you use a resource called Rage. We're going to talk about generating this resource, how to use this resource, some of the fundamentals around that. We'll talk about stances and stance dancing. We will talk about mobility as a warrior, what your gap closers are, things like this. We're going to talk about crowd control, stuns, interrupts, things you can do to control the flow of combat. Heroic strike, glancing blows can be a little confusing, so we're going to talk about that. And then kind of the broad strokes around dealing damage and mitigating damage. So, understanding the melee role. Takanashi, can you share with the people, you know, your perspective of what it means to be a melee?
Yeah, so, I mean, just to be honest and clear, being a melee, you're at a disadvantage in most situations compared to being a ranged class. And one of the things we talk about is that yeah, you have the things that you're closer to the action. You can be in people's face, you can put pressure and stuff like that, and often your job is to put up pressure, right? So you have to think like a melee person, just like in a real life war combat type of thing. You're gonna take some hits, and you need to be able to, survive those hits. You're kind of the meat wall, right? And also, very important thing is to understand the fact that the closer you are to the action, the faster your reaction time has to be to make sure that you can counter whatever is thrown in your face, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
Stats. So strength is, it will do a couple things for you. And you've said this before, Taka. When you increase 1 point of your primary stats, it usually has a ripple effect, and it affects, a multiplicity of different things, right? So as strength, the most straightforward effect is going to give you 2 attack power per point of strength, right? And it's going to increase the amount of damage you can block with the shield, but not your chance to block. So agility, like you said, we'll unpack in a second, but just it won't increase melee attack power. It will increase ranged attack power, so that could be a little bit confusing. You might be wondering, why do I stack this? But it's mainly because it will increase your chance to land a critical strike. It will also increase your chance to dodge and your armor. Yep. And as Taka will explain to you in a second, crit is very important for a warrior. So then going into stamina, that's just a very straightforward health increase. It's 10 hit points per point of stamina. Spirit, different classes benefit differently. They have different kind of multipliers for spirit or whatever, and warriors benefit the most from spirit. So this is more of a consideration when it comes to leveling, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then intellect, last but not least, the only real advantage you get from intellect as a warrior is going to increase the rate at which you increase your weapon skills, right? I think that's about it.
I mean, people refer to the different stats in many different ways, and like you and me, Kargoz, we discussed this a bit, and I would just like to call those stats that you mentioned the primary stats, because that's what everyone has, such as that those are the primary ones. And the strength, agility, stamina, intellect, spirit, some of them are crucial and some of them are not, right? So things like strength and agility and stamina is probably what you'll see the most, important things come level 60. And like you said in your leveling guides, how important spirit is during the leveling phase is a different thing, but we'll get into that later. But understanding that strength is a very overused stat as a warrior, and it's being stacked much more than it should, when things like agility has so much more meaning and potential, and being what you would call a stat that comes alive, right? You can't have the cake and eat it too, right? Mm-hmm. So in most cases, we have to choose between things like strength or agility. Sometimes we can have both, and then we have to choose between crit or hit. Sometimes we get all those four, which is probably some of the best items in game. But as a general rule, we have to kind of choose between the things that gives us what we refer to as value for your buck, right? That's the American term, right, Kargoz?
Bang for your buck, baby. Yep.
Bang for your buck. Yeah. So what we're trying to tell you is that while strength might look sexy, right? Because you're stacking strength, you're getting sick amount of AP or attack power, and when you hit things, I mean, you can potentially get some flat, sick damage, right? But as a warrior, you're kind of depending on what we call to procs, you know, procs in your talent trees, procs in your, on your abilities, which gives you buffs, which increases your damage, right? And one of the most important, or absolutely the most important primary stat when it comes to these types of, behavior is agility. And also agility is a very nice stat to just show how sick the ripple effect is. When you're stacking agility, you're gaining, first of all, you're getting, like you said, a ranged attack power, which might not, be that cool, but if you're pulling, you can do some okay damage to, get that initial threat. If you're doing PvP, you're hitting something. I mean, if you're getting Frost Nova and someone's trying to cap a flag and are at the basin, you can interrupt them with your ranged, right? So, standing still, not doing anything, you might as well be dead, right? And it also increases your armor, and it increases your crit rating, which also increases your damage per second. And I would say that crit is probably the most value for your buck there is as a warrior.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and also at the same time you have to weigh the stats, because like we'll get into, you have a way to calculate, because your hit rating dictates your crit rating cap, right?
So would you say that hit is the super priority as a warrior?
I mean, hit and crit is your priority, and of course, getting a lot of crit is super important, and you have to make sure that you have the hit cap, which is, I mean, according to calculations, it's slightly above 8%. So make sure that you have, to be able to have as much hit as you can. You'll be sitting on probably 9% when you're doing PvE. And but the thing is that when you have 9% hit, you'll reach a crit cap, which is pretty low. So when you're, consumed, world buffed, etc., you have so much crit rating that you want to prioritize your hit rating gear, because
so going above 9%.
Yeah, exactly. So because, like like we discussed earlier, your your crit rating is calculated by, you start off with 100%, right? That's the baseline, and then you reduce, you subtract 27%, which is your miss chance, and then you subtract the dodge rating on a target, and then you subtract the glancing blows, and then you add your hit rating, and this amount is your crit cap, right? So the only way to affect it, because glance percentage is always, it's static, your miss chance is static. I mean, we're talking about the level 63 mob, right?
Right.
So
but if you get hit cap,
I
mean, you're always gonna have 1% chance to miss, right? With both spells and melee physical strikes. Well, if you're capped at 9%, why would you want to continue to stack hit past that?
It's because as we determine this 100 subtracting 27, subtracting the dodge rating, subtracting glancing, plus your hit rating, that means that if you have 9% hit, you have, let's say 30% crit, right? But if you increase your hit rating by 2 or 3, you can raise your crit cap by the same amount, right? So when you're world buff, you might be sitting on 45% crit, with the raid buffed and consumables and whatever, and you'll be pretty much capped at maybe 30%, right? And raising your hit rating will also raise that. So the only way to raise your crit cap is by raising your hit, because other things.
So you're stacking hit, not to hit more, because you're already going to be capped on hit, but to increase your crit cap.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's kind of a really interesting, confusing thing. Wow.
Yeah. So you see warriors, when they're not world buffed, they would go, to the hit rating, the 9% or 8%, whatever is your choice, and then they will prioritize crit rating, on the gear. Mm-hmm. So as soon as you become world buffed and shit like that, you'll prioritize your hit rating instead. We're talking about white hits, right? Here, okay? So your special abilities, like heroic strike and instant abilities like mortal strike or bloodthirst, right, is still gonna benefit from a crit, but your white hits are a huge percentage of your total damage. So having maybe 5% higher crit rating will be insane for your total damage, right? Because your bloodthirst or whatever is not that huge percentage of your total damage. Your white damage is the biggest percentage.
All right. So we'll get into some of the leveling stats. I'll just explain a little bit, because Taka mentioned about spirit. So warriors do benefit more from spirit than any other class. The class that benefits the least from spirit is warlock. The most is warrior. So, and this is something that applies to pretty much every class at the leveling stages of the game. Hold on to gear that has high spirit, because even if you don't want to, swap into, or stack it and stay in it, you can just swap into it between pulls. Now, what spirit does, I also think I failed to mention this when I was explaining the stats. Spirit will boost your out-of-combat health regeneration. So, in combat, it's not really working for you, but out of combat, it does. And, as I say in all my leveling guides, reducing your downtime in a way is almost the same as increasing your kill speed. So, if you can chip away at that leveling equation, you should see an increased rate of speed come leveling. So a lot of warriors will stack spirit early, up to like maybe 30 or so, and they start transitioning out of it towards more agility. And agility, like Taka said, super important. As many warriors have stated, if you don't crit, what's the point? So a lot of your abilities, like your Deep Wounds and Impale package, crit is like the lifeblood that powers your talents and just wakes your talents up and starts to build that combat flow that you want. So agility is also going to reduce your incoming damage, increase your damage. Very good. So
yes, it's like your agility combined with fine points in cruelty. That's 5 crits, and then you have your axe specialization, which you want to spec into. If you want to be as effective as possible, right? So having those 3 things combined, already you're a wrecking machine.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to rage generation, rage usage. So you generate this that red bar underneath your health bar. That is a rage bar, and you are really the only class that uses rage, other than I guess druids can go into bear form. They're using rage as well, but rage is your only resource, and you generate it by dealing damage, but also by taking damage. So the more damage you're taking, the more rage you're generating, and it's a resource that scales pretty well. Considering that you will generate more if you're fighting more targets, and this is opposed to stuff like energy or mana. Mana is more kind of finite in the sense that you will eventually run out of it. You're going to need either abilities or natural mana regeneration per the 5-second rule in order to start regenerating that resource. It's kind of static, and energy ticks every 2 seconds at a certain amount. So in that sense, rage is kind of a really cool, advantageous resource. And am I missing anything there, Taka, or is that it?
It's just it's like really good points. It's like you're the opposite of a mana user, right? Because like a mana user has to stop doing what they're doing, and they'll get more resources. If we stop doing anything, we're gonna lose the resources, right?
Nice point.
It's kind of
Yeah, that makes sense. And then your abilities use rage, right? So there's some little top tips here to help you with rage usage. You just want to, I think, really at a foundational level, you should understand that you don't want to overkill targets. You don't want to overspend rage, and it is advantageous to pool rage. And the more abilities you get, the higher level you get, and especially when you're getting to 60, pooling rage is something you always want to keep in mind, right? You don't want to just spend all your resources just because you can. You don't want to execute something just because you can. Sometimes you just want to finish stuff off with white hits, and we'll talk about more of that later. But just know you generate rage by taking damage, by dealing damage, and you spend it with your abilities. And we can piggyback off this, moving into stances and dancing. So you have 3 stances as a warrior. You have battle stance, you have defensive stance, you have berserker stance. So real quick, before Taka explains some of the more interesting aspect of the stances, battle stance is just a balanced stance. It says it on the tooltip. You're not really getting any damage increase or decrease or anything happening just from this stance. It's just a balanced stance. Defensive stance, you will be taking 10% less damage, but you will be dealing 10% less damage. And every stance offers you access to different abilities. That's another thing you should keep in mind. Berserker stance is your more offensive stance. You have increased critical strike chance, it's 3%, but you will be taking 10% more damage. So those are just kind of what the stances do. Toggling into different stances will make you lose your rage, but there are certain abilities that can help you hang on to that rage, and that's the really easy stuff. So Taka, what do you think about stances and stance dancing and all that?
Yeah, I mean, I love the warrior playstyle with the stances because it pretty much gives you this, it increases the complexity of the class. So looking at retail where they removed stances, makes me want to cry a little because suddenly you're not a warrior anymore. You're kind of, a plate wearing rogue or something. I don't know. And so this is pretty much intertwines with what we talked earlier, rage usage and things, because it's very important to, overuse your rage, because you can't, like you said, you can kill something and you want to make sure you hit them with big numbers, but sometimes it's better to maybe take 5 seconds longer to kill a target than, if it has 100 health and you're using something that deals 500 damage, then just wasted a lot of rage. And in PvP situations, you have to remember that a warrior with 0 rage is like an easy target. But I never, to this date, saw anyone that started to pick a fight with a warrior who had a full rage bar. You're a wrecking train. You're gonna be able to burst down anything within 2 hits because you have auto attacks that will do a lot of damage, and then you have all these instant abilities, and you have maybe some stuns or whatever. And swapping stances and understanding when to use what is a huge deal.
It adds a lot to the skill cap on warriors. That's one of the, at least from my perspective, one of the main reasons of why warrior can be a tricky class to play.
It's like understanding how to swap to shields, go defensive when you're taking a lot of damage, go offensive when you're sure of that the guy in PvP situations maybe, or in PvE situation, that there's not a lot of incoming damage to be expected. You can swap to an offensive stance and pop some cooldowns, pop some special abilities, maybe like Death Wish gives you, increases damage taken, but you'll produce a lot of more damage and stuff like that. So I just love the way warriors can swap stances, and yeah, like you say, it adds to the complexity. Just once you get used to it, it's just a beautiful thing. And understanding, like we said, different abilities in different stances, like never in a PvP situation ride around in defensive stance or battle stance. If there's rogues around, you can get sapped, and you can also get out of other incapacitating effects. So making sure that you're in Berserker stance, you might take more damage, but you can get out of these situations, and you can ride around with a shield, and I don't know. It's just so many ways to counter shit, and these stances are there to be used. So the more you use them, the happier warrior you can be.
Yeah, I mean, and I think so. Stance dancing, guys, just refers to the idea of having to toggle onto different stances throughout, throughout a fight, throughout combat, right? And it kind of looks almost like a dance. There's an animation as you're switching things. So if you're using sweeping strikes in battle stance and you're switching into berserker stance, so you can get a whirlwind off. It kind of it almost looks like visually like a dance of sorts. So that's just, if you hear that term, that's what it's about. So moving on to mobility. How do you feel about warriors and mobility? Do you have an overall feeling towards warriors? Are they a mobile class? Or are they an immobile class?
I mean, we're not as gimped as maybe priests, right? But we're definitely not one of the high mobility classes. But then again, you have your charge in battle stance, and you have intercept in Berserker stance. And if you can use these abilities to your advantage and not what you would call, use them just because you have them on cooldown.
Just waste them, yeah.
Yeah, waste them, and just be a warrior that mindlessly press buttons. I mean, if you can save those things for the right moment, and I like to use them for defensive purposes and just save them for that oh shit moment, then I would say warriors can be mobile in that aspect. But in terms of having high mobility while moving around, not really, right?
Yeah. So you don't really have any movement boosting abilities baked into your kit. You have a charge and you have an intercept available to you, but it's not like you have sprint or something like that. So you have to be careful with some of these gap closers like Taka said with charge and intercept. If you waste them, you're potentially a sitting duck, and people will jump on the opportunity if they see you waste an intercept or something like that. So this will piggyback right off mobility. Crowd control. So people think crowd control, they think sheeps, you know, they think saps and stuff like that. But does the warrior have any crowd control? This ties into what we talked about with charge and intercept, and there's some other stuff as well. What kind of crowd control options does warrior have?
I mean, you have the piercing howl, which I don't care if I'm PvP or PvE, you know, DPS, or if I'm PvE tank. I'm always gonna spec into piercing howl. That's just
so that's 11 points in the Fury tree, right? And that's
yeah.
instant cast, costs what, 10 rage, something like that, and it basically dazes everything around you. It's a small range though, right? But
yeah, but I mean, being able to slow everyone around you is a huge deal. If you're in a PvE situation or PvP, it doesn't matter. It's just insane, right? And also, it doesn't have a cooldown, you know? So as long as you got rage, you can fucking spam and, you know, keep people slowed forever. You know what I mean? So then you have...
and this is opposed to something like maybe a hamstring, which can be removed from you potentially, right? As opposed to...
and also, I mean, the problem with hamstring is that you have to hit everyone, right? But yeah, hamstring is good. Then you have I mean, hamstring, even if you're fighting, let's say, a druid, he can remove the slow by shape-shifting. So
I'm saying, you can't remove a daze, right? So
I mean, yeah. So, but to kill a druid, most people try to kill a druid, but I just hamstring them until they, you know, they want to go and maybe cast a root or whatever, and I just, you know, intercept them to stun them, or I use pummel to, you know, lock their, I mean, interrupt their spell. And you can play around that shit, but just be patient and hamstring and slow a druid. Eventually he'll go you have to use cooldowns, and you'll, you know, if you stay calm, you'll probably kill most druids, right? But and then, yeah, so intimidating shout, which is an AoE fear, which is, you know, that is really undervalued. It's don't do it in dungeons where there's kind of limited space, but yeah, I mean, it's a nice thing if let's say you're up, you know, fighting, your healer is taking damage, even, you know, either in PvP situation or PvE, you can use your intercept, charge the mob that's hitting your healer, and use intimidating shout to get that thing off your healer for a couple of seconds, which can be a lifesaver. And in PvP situation is also huge, right? The fear can be used in so many different ways. We will need a, you know, a whole show just to talk about that.
And it is area of effect, it's AoE, like Taka said, but it's also used at range, right? So it has a small range on it. So potentially, if you're thinking 2 steps ahead and someone, you know, has you know-bit or something, and they're just about to get out of range and they're just about to slip away from you, you still have something on your tool belt you can use to try and control them in the form of piercing, in the form of intimidating shout.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you got charge, you have intercept, you have pummel, as you mentioned. That's an interrupt you have. You also have shield bash,
which can be used in defensive stance and in battle stance. Yeah.
And then piercing howl, hamstring. These are all control options.
Yeah.
All right.
And then you can spec into stun in protection tree.
Right.
The blow, but I mean, some people don't have it, but I see a lot of, I mean, orcs are pretty sick in you know, with the stun ratio or anti-stun ratio, right? So I see a lot of orcs in PvP. They go arms and they put a lot of points in protection because they want to reach is it 15% extra stun resist? And also, while they do that, they spec into the stun, because that stun is, I mean, as long as you're up there, right? You might as well spec one more point, which can be really useful and lifesaver. So I mean, it comes down to playstyle, right?
Yep. So it's concussion blow, stuns the opponent for 5 seconds. Yeah. So okay. Let us move on to Heroic Strike. So the reason why I included Heroic Strike as its own little bullet point is I just wanted to talk about it because it's kind of an interesting ability. It's not like an instant ability. You don't click Heroic Strike and it's like a separate attack. It queues up with your next auto attack, right? And not only does it have a rage cost associated with it, but it will actually prevent you from generating rage on that next queued up Heroic Strike auto attack. So it's a tricky ability. Early on, you're going to be using it. You're not going to have much finesse. You're not going to have many tools at your disposal. So to a certain extent, you will be Heroic Striking in the early stages of leveling. Of course, you want to be sure not to overkill stuff. That's still going to apply to that. But as you progress and level up higher and higher with your warrior, especially once you have your full kit available to you in your talent trees, you have stuff like Mortal Strike and Sweeping Strikes and Whirlwind and stuff like that. Your Heroic Strike usage is going to go way down because it's too costly, right? And you might not even have the rage to sustain Mortal Striking on cooldown, and it's something that is kind of counterintuitive. It was to me, at least, when playing a warrior. You think maybe Heroic Strike's your bread and butter, but you talk to some of the really elite masterful warriors, and they rarely ever use Heroic Strike. What are your thoughts on it, Taka?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even have it on a hotkey actually. I mean, in certain situations, of course, I'm gonna have it, but most of the time, I just put it on a place on my UI that I don't use. I don't have a hotkey for it. In PvP situations, I don't even use Heroic Strike. Most likely because I mean, your cleave is hitting more mobs, is doing much more damage when you have a two-hander. So yeah, and like you said, a lot of warriors spec into the Heroic Strike decrease the rage usage, which might seem like a really good idea, but since you're not going to be using it, those points are just wasted.
Gotcha. Alright, so moving on to Glancing Blows. Here's one that can be very confusing, guys. It was confusing me for a very, very long time. What are Glancing Blows, Taka?
Yeah, so I mean, it's this static percentage, which is 40%. Your white hits has if you're doing, let's say, 100 hits, 40% or 40 of those hits will be Glancing Blows, which has a damage reduction of up to 30%, right? So that's kind of what a Glancing Blow is.
So you have a 40% chance on like boss type targets, right? Like you have a 40% chance to land a Glancing Blow. So I think like the flavor behind it is like the thing is so strong that you're hitting it and you're not always going to be able to fully connect with the target, so it like glances off them and only deals partial damage. So 40% chance, it's kind of inevitable, right? Like you're just stuck with that, right? 40%.
Yeah.
And then if you do have a Glancing Blow, if that 40% does happen, you'll have a damage decrease on that strike. It will always be a non-crit as well, right? Glancing Blow can't crit.
Glancing Blows can never be a critical hit.
Yep, can never be a crit, and you get reduced damage on that. But you can reduce that mitigated damage, right? You can reduce how much damage is reduced.
So this is where weapon skill comes into play,
right?
And why races that has weapon skill to their racials is potentially really strong in PvE situations, because in PvP there's no Glancing Blows. There's no Glancing Blows against a target the same level as you. Of course, if you're fighting a person that's but yeah, in PvP you're gonna be level 60 and whatever, and so when you're increasing your weapon skill, you're also increasing your damage done, right? So you're not reducing the damage loss from glancing blows, but you're increasing your weapon damage, or your damage done, which will flatten the damage loss. So you're pretty much still having the 30% damage reductions on the glancing blows, but you're increasing your damage done by another 30% once you hit plus 10 weapon skill. So you're pretty much at, you know, nothing gained, nothing lost situation. Yeah.
Yep. So I think it's good to understand that conceptually, guys. So even with the weapon skill, you're always going to have to deal with this 40% glancing blow chance, but you can chip away at how much that's going to negatively impact you. And then they cannot occur on players. So people that, like you said, Taka, people that are picking, you know, the human, you know, sword weapon skill for PvP, they are sorely mistaken.
They're screwed.
Okay, so that's glancing blows. Now we'll just talk about dealing damage, and what we mean by this is we'll go through some of the offensive cooldowns you have and damage mitigation, so what your options are to prevent damage from coming in. So right off the bat, I mean, you have stuff like I guess Death Wish is one, right? Death Wish.
Increased damage.
Increased damage, yeah, from dealing damage. For what else comes to mind? There's a lot when it comes to damage mitigation, for sure.
You have the recklessness,
right? Yep.
Which is 30-minute cooldown, and I mean you have the retaliation cooldown as well that does, you know, against melee targets, or when they're hitting you, you deal damage back, right? So I've seen a lot of warriors actually use this shit against the casters, which is confusing, but I guess it has different things that happens in retail, which confuses people to use retaliation in classic WoW as well. But it only deals damage back on melee, not spell damage, right?
Yep. And the other thing about retaliation is you counter attack when they strike you, but it can't be. It doesn't work on attacks from the back, right? Okay. And then there's a maximum of 30 attacks. So when it comes to damage mitigation, you have lots of options. I mean, the other thing with dealing damage is you can go Beserker Stance. You'll be doing more damage. Is another thing, right? And the same thing with damage mitigation. You can go Defensive Stance. Damage mitigation, you can throw on Sword and Board, throw on that shield. You have stuff like Disarm. You have your crowd control options, the stuns that come with that. Shield block, shield wall. And like I don't know if we mentioned this before. We might have, but Intercept is a 3-second stun. That's a pretty hardy stun right there. And what is charge, like 1 second, right? Charge
is 1 second. Also, the bullshit about charge is that you can only use it off combat. So as soon as and the problem is that it has, I mean, it doesn't have short range, but it has shorter range than any ranged class, right? So they can pretty much get you in combat before you're able to charge them. And also, this is when you have to make sure that you understand what class you're playing against. If you have high latency, you know, you have bad MS, never ever expect to be able to get a charge off. Because the other person is going to get you in combat, or another warrior is going to charge you before you charge them. So if I'm in a situation like that, I always get in their face, so at least they're not going to get a charge on me, right? Because if I can't have fun, then neither are you.
It makes sense. Okay, yeah, I think we have it covered. Damage mitigation, like there's stuff, other things you can do, obviously related to positioning, like trying to get out of line of sight and stuff like that. But we're just talking about the broad stroke abilities here that comprise the class mechanics for Warrior. Is there anything else that comes to mind, Taka, that you think might be useful for class mechanics, or have we covered it all?
Yeah, I mean, Know how to play your class, but most importantly, know how everyone else plays theirs.